The debt that changed everything. The stars stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of infinite darkness, speckled with the cold glimmer of distant suns. Beneath that celestial expanse, the massive galactic trade station Vernar 4 floated like an artificial moon, a hub of commerce, diplomacy, and power. It was here, in the heart of alien bureaucracy, that humanity's greatest gamble was about to unfold. Inside one of the station's vast negotiation chambers, a human delegation sat across from a group of alien officials whose expressions ranged from smug amusement to barely concealed contempt. At the center of the human side stood Dr. Evelyn Carter, a woman whose composed demeanor masked the weight of an entire species' future. She was flanked by Ambassador Daniel Holt and Commander Victor Rains, both silent but watchful, their presence more than ceremonial. They were here to make sure that the galaxy understood one immutable truth: humans always pay their debts. On the alien side, the Xaltar High Council presided over the negotiations. The Xaltar were a proud and ancient race, their elongated bodies covered in iridescent chitin, their multiple eyes glinting with a cruel intelligence. Their leader, Arch-Administrator Vorel, was an imposing figure even by his species' standards, his mandibles clicking rhythmically as he examined the contract displayed before him. This agreement, he rasped in a voice that sent shivers through the human delegation, was drafted 50 years ago, when your kind were barely capable of interstellar travel. A fledgling race seeking survival in a galaxy that does not forgive weakness. The Xaltar Dominion was generous, offering you access to advanced terraforming technology. And now, after all this time, you come to settle your debt. There was a low murmur among the assembled aliens. The galactic community had all but forgotten about humanity's debt, assuming Earth would either default or be absorbed into the greater empires like so many lesser species before them. And yet, here they were, ready to pay in full. Dr. Carter remained unfazed. She gestured toward the holographic contract, its alien symbols flickering under the station's artificial lights. "We have reviewed the original agreement," she said, her voice clear and firm. "The terms specified that, in exchange for your technology, humanity would provide an equivalent repayment in either raw resources or technological exchange upon the agreed deadline." Administrator Vorel leaned back, his mandibles clicking in what passed for amusement. "A deadline that has long since passed, Doctor. Do you truly believe your species has anything of value to offer us now?" His words dripped with derision. "Do you honestly expect us to accept repayment from a race that was still debating planetary unification when this contract was signed?" The other alien delegates chuckled, some in amusement, others in anticipation of what they assumed would be a human plea for leniency. The Xaltar had been prepared for this moment, expecting Earth's delegation to offer an extension, perhaps a new bargain where humanity would submit itself as a vassal species. But that was not why they were here. Dr. Carter activated the next phase of the hologram. Instantly, data streams filled the chamber, glowing symbols and figures scrolling faster than any single delegate could process at once. What began as amusement in the aliens' expressions quickly turned to confusion, and then alarm. Ambassador Holt spoke next, his voice measured but carrying an undercurrent of power. "These records detail every gram of material extracted from our planets in preparation for this repayment, every advancement in our technology, every quantum fluctuation of energy harvested, every strategic partnership forged, every adaptation we have made to survive. What you see before you is the full extent of our recompense." Vorel's mandibles stilled. The room had gone silent except for the hum of the hologram. The data was comprehensive, far too comprehensive for a species still considered technologically behind. Dr. Carter's gaze hardened. "We have not merely gathered resources, Administrator. We have studied, we have learned, and we have built. Your contract was not merely an obligation, it was an opportunity. An opportunity to show the galaxy exactly what humanity is capable of." The Xaltar delegation stiffened. This wasn't just repayment. This was precision. This was planning. and it had been in motion for decades. Commander Rains finally spoke, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that only someone who had stared down death and walked away could muster. "The question isn't whether we can pay," he said, his tone edged with quiet menace. "It's whether you truly understand the price of what you've set in motion." The murmurs among the aliens grew louder, uncertainty creeping into their voices. Humanity had never been seen as a major power, not a true contender in the great interstellar game. But the sheer scale of the data presented before them hinted at something they had never considered: a plan. A long-term strategy executed flawlessly over 5 decades. Vorel narrowed his many eyes. "This is an elaborate display, but you cannot expect us to believe that your kind, in a mere 50 years, have matched what took us millennia to achieve." "You misunderstand," Dr. Carter replied smoothly. "We didn't match you. We learned from you. We learned from all of you, every species we encountered, every system we studied, every agreement we upheld. We didn't just repay our debt. We grew beyond it." The holographic display shifted again, this time showcasing Earth's modern technological advancements: planetary-scale quantum computing, fusion-core starships capable of bending space-time more efficiently than anything in the Dominion, neural-linked AI assisting in economic and military logistics, genetic modifications that had doubled human lifespans, and terraforming techniques superior to those once gifted to them by the Xaltar. For the first time in recorded history, the Xaltar, masters of galactic finance and manipulation, were uncertain. Vorel's mandibles twitched. "You planned this." Dr. Carter didn't smile, but her eyes carried the weight of humanity's greatest truth. "No, Administrator," she said, voice calm. "We simply paid attention." Silence fell over the chamber as the reality of the situation sank in. Humanity wasn't just paying their debt. They were settling the score. And for the first time in the history of the Dominion, an ancient, all-powerful empire that had subjugated countless species through economic dominance, they realized they might have made a mistake. A very, very costly mistake. One they could never undo. The negotiations were far from over. But the power dynamic had shifted, and the entire galaxy was about to feel the consequences. The unraveling of an empire. The moment the human delegation left the chamber, the Xaltar Council fell into chaos. Their hushed murmurs turned into frantic conversations, and soon, outright shouting. The weight of what had just transpired was undeniable. Humanity had not only settled their debt, but had done so with such precision and calculation that it left the Dominion vulnerable in a way they had never anticipated. Arch-Administrator Vorel remained seated, his multiple eyes darting across the holographic projection still floating in the chamber. The numbers didn't lie. Humanity had surpassed their expectations in ways that bordered on the impossible. Their economic models had not accounted for this. How? How had an insignificant species, one that was expected to remain in debt for centuries, emerged as a power capable of standing at eye level with the greatest civilizations in the galaxy? One of the Xaltar ministers, High Analyst Trilok, finally broke the stunned silence. His carapace gleamed under the dim chamber lights as his voice quivered with disbelief. "They knew," he hissed, mandibles twitching in agitation. "They didn't just honor the contract. They used it. They weaponized debt repayment." Vorel's mandibles ground together in frustration. He was not a fool. He had seen the signs, though he had dismissed them at the time. Small shifts in economic patterns, minor anomalies in trade agreements, new companies, investments, and contracts. Subtle, but all pointing to a quiet but deliberate growth in human influence across the galactic economy. And now, after 50 years, that quiet presence had suddenly become dominant. The humans, they planned this from the start. Another council member, Senator Vilmara, muttered in disbelief. They spent 50 years embedding themselves into our systems, studying our trade routes, deciphering our weaknesses, all while we laughed at their so-called debt servitude. Trilok's expression darkened. They didn't just study us. They took everything. our methodologies, our economic strategies, our technological blueprints. They optimized them. His voice lowered. And now, they're more efficient than us. Vorel slammed a clawed hand against the table, silencing the chamber. Enough, he growled. We cannot allow this to destabilize the Dominion. Humanity may have played their hand well, but they are still just one species. They are not irreplaceable. There was a pause. Then, a new voice entered the conversation. I wouldn't be so sure about that, came a dry tone from the shadows of the chamber. The gathered officials turned to see Ambassador Kelveris, the Proximian trade representative. The Proximians were one of the Dominion's oldest allies, known for their economic cunning and near-perfect memory when it came to trade negotiations. If he was concerned, then the situation was far worse than they feared. Kelveris stepped forward, his golden eyes narrowing as he studied the Xaltar officials. I had my doubts when I first heard of humanity's ambitions, but after seeing their technological leaps firsthand, I ran an independent assessment. The chamber waited as the Proximian retrieved a data chip and inserted it into the central console. A new hologram appeared, one displaying galactic market trends over the last century. The projection zoomed in on the last 50 years. There, clear as day, was the pattern. A slow, steady integration of human-led enterprises into nearly every major sector of the economy. Mining, transport, energy production, quantum computing, agriculture, defense. Everywhere the Dominion had a foothold, humanity had placed a countermeasure. Vorel stared at the data in horrified realization. It wasn't just that humanity had repaid their debt. They had used the repayment as a cover to infiltrate the galactic economy at every possible level. Kelveris's voice was eerily calm. You think you can replace them, Administrator? Tell me, how do you plan to do that when over 40% of your logistical infrastructure is already running on human design systems? When most of your corporate holdings have unknowingly invested in human-backed industries? When your own military supply chains depend on the efficiency of human-modified protocols? The word sent a visible shudder through the assembled council members. They have embedded themselves so deeply into our economy that severing ties with them would cripple the Dominion for decades, Kelveris concluded. And the worst part, they did it legally. Silence gripped the chamber. This wasn't just a power shift. It was checkmate. The Xaltar had used debt to enslave 100 species before. They had perfected the art of economic manipulation. They had crushed entire civilizations with bureaucracy alone. And yet, in a single generation, humanity had turned their own system against them. Vorel exhaled slowly, his claws curling against the table's surface. His mind raced through the possibilities. If humanity had gained this level of influence without military action, what would happen if they did decide to flex their newfound power? They never intended to beg for forgiveness, Vilnera whispered, barely able to process what she was seeing. They came here to show us that they are no longer bound by our rules. Triloc's voice was hollow. We were supposed to be their overlords. He turned toward Vorel, his expression a mixture of disbelief and growing fear. Instead, we might have just made them our successors. A heavy silence followed. Then Vorel spoke, his voice cold and calculating once more. We need contingencies, he muttered. We need to contain this before it spirals beyond our control. But even as he said it, he knew. It was already too late. The galaxy was changing. And for the first time in thousands of years, the Xaltar were no longer at the top. And that was a reality they were not prepared to face. The silent takeover. The Xaltar Dominion prided itself on control. Control over trade. Control over knowledge. Control over species too naive to understand the true nature of power. And yet, in the wake of humanity's shocking maneuver, that control was slipping, faster than they could contain. Across the galaxy, a subtle but undeniable shift had begun. Xaltar trading hubs, once the beating heart of interstellar commerce, were seeing an unexpected drop in activity. The fluctuating economy, once dictated solely by the Dominion's iron grasp, was now reacting to unseen variables. Variables that all pointed back to a single source: humanity. Arch-Administrator Vorel had barely left the negotiation chambers before a flood of emergency reports swarmed his personal console. Markets shifting erratically, long-standing business agreements dissolving overnight, entire sectors of the galactic economy quietly realigning toward human-controlled enterprises. His mandibles twitched in irritation. This was not how the Dominion worked. It dictated, it ruled, it extracted wealth from the weak, and yet somehow, a species that had started as debtors was now wielding influence over their very economy. "This is unacceptable," he growled to his inner council. "I want a full audit of every human-backed corporation in our territory. I want to know who allowed this infestation to spread, and I want it purged." A group of advisors hesitated before stepping forward. "Administrator," one of them ventured cautiously, "we have already initiated investigations, but there is an issue." Vorel's gaze darkened. "What issue?" The advisor pulled up a holographic display. It showed a complex web of investments, subsidiaries, and trade deals. At first glance, it looked normal, until one zoomed out to view the broader picture. A silent financial takeover. Human corporations, acting through intermediaries, had quietly bought up shares in every major sector of the Dominion's economy: energy, supply chains, starship manufacturing, even key elements of the Dominion's military procurement system. It was impossible. It was genius. And it had been happening right under their noses. One of the analysts swallowed hard. "If we attempt to sever these connections now, we risk catastrophic disruptions to our own infrastructure. The humans have embedded themselves too deeply into our supply lines." Another spoke up hesitantly. "The problem, Administrator, is that we didn't see it happening because they never violated a single law." Vorel's rage boiled beneath his chitinous skin. "You mean to tell me that we've been outmaneuvered by our own legal framework?" The room fell into silence, because the answer was obvious. Yes, that was exactly what had happened. The weight of an empire. Meanwhile, on Earth, the situation was unfolding exactly as Dr. Evelyn Carter and her team had predicted. Sitting in the command center of the Terran Strategic Affairs Division, she watched as the latest reports streamed in from agents across Dominion space. The Exaltar were flailing, scrambling to regain control. But there was nothing they could do. Not legally, at least. "They're trying to find a way to kick us out of their economy," Ambassador Daniel Holt murmured, arms crossed as he studied the reports. "But every move they make just exposes how much they actually need us." Dr. Carter smirked. They thought they were debt masters. They never considered the possibility of becoming debtors themselves. Holt shook his head, still marveling at the sheer scale of what they had pulled off. "They thought we were just another species to exploit. They never imagined we would surpass them at their own game." Across the room, Commander Victor Rains sat quietly, his eyes focused on the tactical overlays. "We need to be ready," he muttered. "The Exaltar aren't the type to accept this without a fight." Dr. Carter nodded. "Of course, but they won't fight us directly. They'll try to undermine us in other ways first. Political pressure, economic sanctions, perhaps even covert sabotage." Holt exhaled sharply. "It won't work. They don't realize how deep this runs. We didn't just join the galactic economy. We redefined it." And that was the truth that the Exaltar were now being forced to confront. Humanity hadn't simply built businesses. They had changed the rules. And now, the Dominion found itself trapped within those rules. The desperation of an empire. In the heart of the Dominion's capital world, Vorel stood before the High Council of the Dominion, his voice seething with frustration. "We must act," he demanded. "We cannot allow humanity to consolidate this power unchecked. If we do nothing, we may never be able to challenge them again." The gathered council members exchanged uncertain glances. One of the elder statesmen, Chancellor Vochtel, let out a slow, measured breath. "You speak of action, But what action is possible? The humans have not broken any laws. They have not invaded our space. They have not made demands. They have outmaneuvered us. Vorel snapped. Voktal's gaze hardened. Yes, and that is the first time in 5,000 years that such a thing has happened. The chamber fell silent, because no one could deny it. For centuries, the Xaltar Dominion had ruled through economic subjugation. They never needed war, never needed fleets of warships or planetary invasions. They controlled the flow of wealth, and through it, controlled the destiny of countless civilizations. But now, humanity had shattered that illusion. And what was worse, they had done it so efficiently, so methodically, that there was no counterplay. Vorel clenched his claws. Then we find other means. We cannot allow them to consolidate further. Another council member, Minister Keldis, shifted uncomfortably. If we push too hard, we may fracture the Dominion. Humanity's influence is already bleeding into our own systems. If we force conflict, we may lose allies, perhaps even sectors of our own empire. Vorel's eyes darkened. So what? We simply allow this to happen. Allow these upstarts to take our place. Voktal exhaled again. That is not what I am saying. His mandibles clicked thoughtfully. I am saying that we must redefine our strategy. Vorel narrowed his eyes. Meaning? Voktal leaned forward. For centuries, we have ruled by force of economy. But the humans, they have introduced something new. A philosophy of collaboration, one that is rapidly overtaking the old ways. A heavy pause. Perhaps, Voktal continued, if we cannot remove them, we must consider something else. The words hung in the air like a dangerous thought left unspoken. Vorel realized what was being suggested. A partnership. A shift in power. And worst of all, an acknowledgement that the Xaltar were no longer at the top of the food chain. His mandibles tightened. He wasn't sure what was worse, that humanity had bested them, or that some among the Dominion's leadership were already considering bowing to them. Either way, the old order was crumbling. And the galaxy would never be the same again. The inevitable reckoning. The ripple effects of humanity's silent takeover were now undeniable. What had once been a rigid, unquestionable power structure, the Xaltar Dominion's iron grip over the galaxy, was unraveling at an accelerating pace. But the true consequences had yet to be fully realized. For every trade agreement that collapsed, a new one, backed by human ingenuity and pragmatism, emerged in its place. For every Xaltar-controlled corporation that found itself struggling, a human-funded subsidiary was waiting in the shadows, ready to absorb its assets. And yet, the Dominion refused to acknowledge the truth. They were losing. The collapse begins. On Vorik Prime, the Dominion's second-largest economic hub, the once thriving commerce center was experiencing something unthinkable. The stock markets were in freefall. Xaltar traders, once the unquestioned masters of finance, found themselves overwhelmed as human-led enterprises surged ahead. For the first time in thousands of years, the Xaltar banking network faced instability. And in the shadow of this crisis, a desperate attempt was being made to take back control. Deep within the Xaltar Ministry of Commerce, a meeting was taking place, one that, had it been held a century earlier, would have determined the fate of entire civilizations with a single decision. But not today. This is unacceptable. Supreme Minister Graxel slammed a clawed fist onto the conference table, his normally smooth, iridescent exoskeleton tinged with frustration. How have we allowed this infestation to take hold of our economy? Why were there no safeguards against such an intrusion? His words were met with silence. The other ministers, once powerful figures in their own right, looked uncomfortable, because they knew the answer. Because they had welcomed humanity into their economic ecosystem, believing them to be nothing more than eager debt payers. They had underestimated them. And now, they were dependent on them. One of the analysts, a nervous-looking Xaltar with pale, translucent skin, spoke cautiously. Minister, the reality is that if we attempt to cut humanity out of our economic network, we risk severe consequences. Graxel's mandibles snapped in irritation. Elaborate. The analyst took a deep breath before pulling up a data projection. The hologram displayed every critical infrastructure system within the Dominion's economy: energy distribution, logistical hubs, manufacturing sectors, and planetary defense networks. A frightening percentage of them were now running on human-designed efficiency models. And if those models were suddenly removed, our projections show that a complete severance from human influence would result in a 35% collapse of Dominion-wide trade within the first month, the analyst explained. Within the first year, that number climbs to 62%. A hushed murmur filled the chamber. It was worse than anyone had imagined. Graxel's claws curled in frustration. And what of military applications? Can we leverage our dominance there? Another silence. A different minister, Director Calvin, spoke this time. His tone was measured, but the grim expression on his face told the true story. Our military depends on human-designed logistical optimizations, Calvin admitted reluctantly. Their AI-driven resource distribution protocols have reduced waste by nearly 40%. We have unknowingly become reliant on their advancements. That was the final, inescapable truth. Humanity hadn't overtaken the Dominion. They had made themselves indispensable. The denial of an empire. On Saltar Prime, the Dominion's capital world, Arch-Administrator Vorel paced his private chambers, the weight of his empire's future pressing upon him like an unbearable force. "This cannot continue," he muttered under his breath. From the moment he had realized the scope of humanity's economic infiltration, he had been scrambling for an answer, any answer that would allow the Dominion to regain its supremacy. But every possible course of action came with catastrophic consequences. They could not shut humanity out without crippling themselves. They could not financially undermine them, because humanity had already built redundancies into their infrastructure. And military action. That was a last resort, one that Vorel knew could not be won, because humanity had proven something that no species had ever done before. They weren't just survivors. They weren't just traders. They were builders, planners, visionaries, and every single move they had made had led to this moment. A chime interrupted his thoughts. It was an encrypted communication, marked urgent. Vorel activated the transmission, and a holographic image of Ambassador Kelveris of the Proximian Trade Alliance materialized before him. The Proximians had been one of the Dominion's strongest allies. Their mathematical precision and economic acumen had made them indispensable partners in intergalactic finance. And now, even they were turning against the Dominion. Arch-Administrator Kelveris greeted, his golden eyes filled with what looked almost like pity. "I believe it is time we speak openly." Vorel narrowed his gaze. "If you are here to lecture me on humanity's growing influence, I am here to tell you that the Proximian Trade Alliance will be redirecting its economic operations." Kelveris cut him off smoothly. "Effective immediately." Vorel felt his stomach drop. He started. "Humanity has demonstrated a level of pragmatic cooperation that we find preferable," Kelveris continued. "Their willingness to innovate, to share knowledge, and to adapt to market conditions surpasses anything the Dominion has offered in the last 1,000 years." Vorel clenched his jaw. "You would betray centuries of cooperation. For a newcomer species," Kelveris' expression didn't waver, "I would make a logical choice." And that was when Vorel finally understood. This wasn't just about power. This wasn't just about control. It was about the future. And the future belonged to humanity. The turning point. The days that followed were unlike anything the Dominion had ever experienced. The Proximian Trade Alliance made their defection official. The Centaura Mining Syndicate followed suit. Then came the Relian Scientific Consortium. One by one, the largest economic players in the galaxy began shifting their operations away from the Dominion and toward human-led enterprises. The old order was dying, and in its place, a new power was rising. not through war, not through conquest, but through the single most unbreakable force in the galaxy. A fulfilled promise. Humanity had paid its debt, and in doing so, they had built something far more valuable. They had built the future. And now, the galaxy would either follow their lead or be left behind.